Hello there everybody and welcome to a new video for Age of Wonders 4. This one got 10 advanced tips and tricks for combat in general. So it's all about things that you can do once you have understood the basic mechanics that will help you minimize the losses of your combats and get the most out of your combat experiences without blowing up too many of your units. So let's get started with number one. I want to talk about something very simple and understandable. Once you got the hang of it, it's really that massive. So I want to talk about pinning and control zones first. So whenever you post down a melee unit right next to these guys, you have pinned them. A pinned unit is no longer capable of moving away without a punishment. There is only one type of unit, and that's skirmisher units who are immune against that effect. Everybody else will get smacked when they dare to move away from these units, and this is something that you always should use wherever you can. Just pin down those guys and use those control zones, because otherwise you will really just give away free damage. That's pretty much the whole thing in a nutshell. It's that valuable to just be able to block the enemy's movement, and if they want to move, they will get an attack. You can also do things like these, not posting them right directly like there, but here instead I use the control zone of my warriors to make it harder for the enemy to get close to my ranged units. So we post them down like that, and this way the enemy will have to take much more of a distance to avoid getting smacked here, or they just ignore that and they will just take some damage and still use more movement points and will have a low impact when they finally reach the supporters, and next turn you can collapse on them. Either way, using these control zones and the pinning mechanic is easy to apply once you've understood what it does. You can't just block the enemy and deal free damage with it. It is a pretty deep thing where you can do a lot by anticipating the enemy's movement, so just practice it, and the basics you've seen here, there's a lot more of goodness that you can do there. So let's get on over directly to number two. I want to talk about how awesome temporary HP in this game are. As you see here, these guys are barely alive anymore, and when we add in some temporary HP, not only do they regain HP and they are obviously capable to fight again, but in case you didn't notice it, people get resurrected here, so I'll show you more directly. Let's heal these guys up. So the entire casualty system can be counteracted with the virtual HP system. So here we go, the guy's ready again to do some good old blocking here. So this way, if you have healers, supporters, people that add in temporary HP, you can often ignore the amount of HP your troop has when the combat starts. It's pretty amazing, because these guys would be, without supporters and temporal HP, not really usable in that combat anymore. If we add up the next dude here, let's do this for the sake of demonstration. It's not really a well-used spell here, but after this, with the regeneration on top of that, he's good as new. And in a nutshell, utilizing your temporal HP will make your armies much more flexible, because having supporters on your board means that you can pretty much ignore at some point how banged up your troops are if you prepare it carefully. Number three, I want to talk about a thing you need to keep in mind. Offensive units tend to be very vulnerable in this game, and it is very important to note that. While this is a tier 3 shock unit, they have quite some resistances. If you run skirmishers or any shock unit of a low tier, often they come with a low or almost no amounts of resistances, and it's up to you to utilize that well. How does that work? It is quite simple. Just avoid your highly offensive units to be targeted in the first 2 turns. Use your defensive guys like these here to soak up the alpha strike of the enemy, and once the casualty system kicks in, your highly vulnerable units won't keel over if they take a blow. Usually the hardest hits come in turns 1, 2, and 3, and after that It's just the afterglow when the cooldowns settle in, because every hard-hitting spell has a cooldown. So basically, you have to learn in this game to use your highly high damage units in those windows of opportunity when heavy damage things are down, casualty effects kick in, all these things. If you just rush headlong into the combat with your offensive units, it will still work, but you will get less bang for your buck. There's a lot of room for optimizations with your timing and positioning around your offensive units, and use them wisely and get the most out of them. All right, so I want to talk in number 4 something about your roster setups, a little bit more of a more strategical build-up thing. So I want to talk about the distribution of offensive versus defensive units. So offensive units, pretty clear: shock troopers, skirmishers. Many fighter types also fall into that category. Basically, if they are better at dealing damage than at soaking damage, they are basically an offensive unit. So in a nutshell, I think with a 60-40 distribution, with 60% offensive units and 40% defensive units, you will never go too wrong, but never too ideal either. But it's a very, very good rule of thumb. If you have no idea what you're doing with your current culture, just go for a slight bias of more offensive units than defensive units, and you will be quite well off, because usually utility is extremely valuable, but you need less utility than damage in a nutshell. All right, let's get on over to number 5, the right next wonderful thing in this game. I want to talk about hard CC, crowd control, however you want to call it, disable effects. These are in this game, and pretty much in every other game of this category, a massive asset to have. And I want to emphasize that fact so you can take more advantage out of it. Every unit that can stun or otherwise force the enemy to skip his entire next action, be it the entire action or only movement, that's devastating for melee units, for example, it is a massive thing, because this way you can separate the enemy troops from one another. You can soften their blow. You can take control over various situations. You can avoid that big hard hitter from taking his action. There's so many things that you can do when you are allowed to choose who's not going to act next turn, because you will never be able to blow up everybody in the first turn. So this is pretty powerful, and the more of these effects you allocate in your army, in your spell kit, and these things, the more versatile you'll get, and the less damage your troops will take during combat, and that's always a good thing. Number 6, I want to talk about damage types, and I want to talk about the fact that there are many, many various ways to deal damage. There's physical damage, there's elemental types of damage, there's spirit damage, there's poison damage. All in all, in a nutshell, it's very important to note just one thing: don't put all your pennies into one bucket there. Just try to have a as high as possible spread of various sources of damage, because resistances come up in this game, and most of the time you don't see all of the resistances at once. For example, this guy is highly resilient against my blight damage, but he's weak against the fire damage that I do. So by spreading out your damage profile into more different approaches, you'll never run into the situation where one type of resistance, one type of defense will counter your entire army. And most of the time, when it comes down to elemental flavors, let's call it like that, you're bound to the tomes that you pick and all those things. So in a nutshell, you have a pretty high control over this fact, and it's pretty useful to know that, especially since different elemental effects come often with different side effects, like fire damage sets the enemy on fire, blight damage poisons the enemy, electrical damage electrifies the enemy. The more different sources of damage over time effects that you have like that, the better. And that goes on and on and on, and in a nutshell, you just lose a lot of opportunities if you just force into one or two damage types too heavily. Although you can utilize weaknesses harder, but I'd only recommend that if you really know that it's worth it, like, for example, because your enemy has all over the border fire weakness, something like that. But these are fringe cases, in my experience at least. Let's get on over to number 7. I want to talk about magic now. We're starting to talk first about those spells that you have here, and in general the combat casting point system. So this is your basically your Joker box. You got access here to all of the spells that you've learned. It's one thing that some of the people I've met didn't know. You can favorize them here, but that's not the point. The point here is that these spells should be always used when you have the feeling that you can protect your folks from a lot of damage one way or another. I always try to minimize my own losses as much as possible in games like these, so that's my agenda, to use my spells most of the time. Another thing worth noting, always try to use your spell every turn, but if there is no good reason to use your spell that turn, by all means don't waste it, because your combat casting points won't come back during a fight, usually, unless you have some freaky build going on for that. But in a nutshell, you will always only have 55 points of mana, for example, here, that I can spend. So sometimes it's better to do nothing when you don't see a big effect. And on the other hand, if you can just slap down one spell, which avoids one enemy from killing off one of your units, it's totally worth the effort. And that's how you should always look at your spells. Try to use them as much as possible and only as often as necessary. And if you master that well, you can have a huge impact with that. Now, number 8 goes into a similar venue. It's also magic. I want to talk about summons and their value towards the AI. You can have summons either via stuff like here, the hero's skills, I taught him that, or you can also summon stuff with your spells like there. All in all, summons are outright amazing against the AI, because the AI is dumb like a piece of bread. I'm very sorry to say it like that bluntly, but you can abuse the AI heavily with summons. To give you a good example here, this Vine Prison spell is amazing because it does nothing else than just spawn some stuff here. And the AI now has that weird behavior of having a pretty high bias of just whacking these things instead of engaging on my units, and every type of summon can be treated similarly. They are excellent distractions, because while I don't want to lose any of my standard roster due to the experience point system, we really want to keep them alive under any circumstance, these guys are throwaway packages. It doesn't matter when they die at the end of the fight. This guy's elemental here. I can totally play it reckless. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages of summons in general. You can take advantage of a very reckless playstyle that you usually wouldn't want to apply, because generally it's way better to play conservative and keep your dudes alive so they can shine into high ranks and get all those nice HP and stat bonuses for the last war where you win the game, stuff like that. So in a nutshell, summons are an amazing tool, and I personally find them too strong, because in all honesty, the AI is really bad at taking any sophisticated choices when it comes down to target priority, and you can abuse that quite hard. So if it ever comes down to you as too cheesy, well, you know why, because AI is not that smartly. It's sadly something that I've seen in most of these games, but, well, I've said what I wanted to say. Let's move on over to number 9. Let's talk about a few positioning tips. Some bread and butter things always worth knowing in this game. So, first of all, when you position your troops, try to avoid clustering them together like I did here. This is a bad thing. I could make it even worse if I'd make it like that. Here, they are highly vulnerable to any AoE effect. So any AoE source of damage would totally mess my day. So always, therefore, try to position your dudes that there's free spots between your formations that make it a little bit more inefficient. But that's one thing. The other thing is use territory or terrain things here. This, for example, is an excellent choke point. If we just set up one troop here, we have totally walled off the enemy, and it's now impossible for them to get back here into our backline. Our backline could now pelt away safely onto the enemy. If this would be a larger enemy army, this could make a big difference, because before they crack open any of your units here, this natural gorge with those things here would make a terrific point of resistance. Same goes for this spot, and the more you utilize these narrow spots and stuff like that, the more you can drive your enemy insane and cut them off the advantage of higher numbers, stuff like that. As a last thing, positioning wise, the best thing that you can do is always trying to encircle your enemy with defensive units up front, ranged units behind, supporters mixed in between. That's the, well, the generic cookie cutter mold, which you have to adapt to every strategy that you run, of course, because every culture plays a little bit differently. Now then, let's head on over to the last point, number 10. I want to talk about heroes. Heroes are your Joker units. Heroes can be anything because they're going to be defined by the weapon they wield. So in a nutshell, your hero can be any type of unit that you need for your army. And that's pretty amazing. When you design your hero in the faction creator at the beginning of the game, you get to select which weapon they'll get. And basically you can define if you want to have a shock unit. That's what these weapons here do. Or you want to have a supporter or an archer or a shield unit. You can basically build whatever you want, and as some bonus topping on that, they will turn into massive beasts of their role the higher their level grows, because they are basically a super unit. This guy here will grow over the course of the time into a super shock unit and will ultimately excel most of the basic roster's capabilities. So use this thing on your heroes to make sure that you either emphasize the strengths of your army heavier, like if you are Alpha Strike heavy, you could have a hero that's emphasizing harder on that, or that's my personal approach, you can also use the hero to fix some glaring deficiencies of your faction. For example, here I'm playing Feudal, and the Shock Troop is my tier 3 unit, and this way I had very early access directly from the get-go to a shock unit, which can break enemies' defensive stances, which is really nice to have, because it makes it easier to kill off stuff, and this way I basically have given myself a very, very early access on that special skill, on this specialty troop type. There's lots of other things that you can do with your hero, and try to think of your hero as something to get the best out of your faction, out of your current build, and then try to adapt them as much as possible, because no other unit can be that massively individualized than the compared to anybody else. Like, none of these troops you can individualize as heavily as these guys. Now then, that's all I had to say for this one. I hope you enjoyed. There is, of course, another combat tutorial in the making with even more advanced tips and tricks, so I'm all ears if you have something to add or some thoughts on top of that. I really love to hear from you folks. Leave me a thumbs up if you enjoyed, consider subscribing, and as usual, check out the description box. If this is your first Age of Wonders tutorial of mine, there is a playlist link leading to all the stuff that I made so far. Apart from that, I want to thank again all the supporters of this channel. I deeply, deeply appreciate your help. And if you want to know what I'm talking about, check out the links to Patreon, PayPal, and Buy Me a Coffee, and take my gratitude for taking a look at them. And either way, I really, really appreciate you hanging around, watching these videos, and I hope you have an amazing day. See you there. Goodbye.